It was a Tuesday morning in Millfield County, Texas, where the summer heat pressed down like a heavy hand, and the drought had turned green pastures into cracked earth that looked like broken promises. This was a place where folks measured wealth not by bank accounts, but by how many meals you could skip and still keep your dignity intact, where pride ran deeper than wells, and where sometimes a man's worth was tested not by what he could afford to buy, but by what he couldn't afford to lose. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sheriff Marcus Thompson stood on the courthouse steps that morning, badge dulled by 3 years of budget cuts and overtime shifts that paid in sleepless nights rather than dollars. His uniform was clean but worn, pressed by his own hands because the dry cleaner had closed down last spring, along with half the businesses on Main Street. At 34, Marcus carried the weight of a county that seemed to shrink a little more each year, losing families to bigger cities and bigger dreams, leaving behind empty houses and the kind of quiet that settled in your bones like winter cold. But this morning was different. This morning, the courthouse steps were crowded with people who'd driven in from 3 counties over, drawn by word of an auction that nobody wanted to attend, but everybody felt compelled to witness. They came with folded bills in their pockets and sympathy in their eyes, because what was being sold today wasn't just property, it was the final chapter of a family's story, written in legal documents and sealed with a gavel's fall. The Daniels farm sat 40 acres out on rural Route 47, where the road turned to gravel and mailboxes stood like lonely sentinels, marking driveways that led to dreams deferred. For 3 generations, the Daniels family had worked that land, raised on cattle, grown corn, and built the kind of life that existed in faded photographs and Sunday sermons about honest work and God's provision. But honest work doesn't always pay the medical bills when cancer comes calling, and God's provision sometimes looks different than what you prayed for on your knees in a hospital chapel at 3 in the morning. David Daniels had fought the fight that no man should have to fight, watching his savings drain away like water through sand while his body betrayed him month by month. He'd held on long enough to see his youngest twins take their first steps, long enough to teach his oldest boy how to drive the old pickup truck, long enough to tell his wife Claire that she was stronger than she knew, and that somehow, some way, everything would work out. Then winter came early that year, and David Daniels went to sleep on a February night and didn't wake up to see the spring he'd promised his children would be better. Claire Daniels had tried to hold it together. God knows she'd tried. Working double shifts at the diner in town, selling off the cattle one by one, watching the bank notices pile up on the kitchen table like autumn leaves that nobody wanted to rake. But 8 children need more than love and determination. They need food and clothes and a roof that doesn't leak when the storms roll in from the west. They need heat in winter and hope in summer. And sometimes hope is the hardest thing to keep alive when the bills outnumber the dollars and the future looks smaller every day. So here they stood, this Tuesday morning in July, while strangers with calculators and cold eyes walked through their home, measuring square footage and estimating value, reducing a lifetime of memories to lot numbers and legal descriptions. Claire stood apart from the crowd, her 8 children arranged around her like a fortress of small faces and uncertain futures. Tommy, 16 and tall like his father, held the twins' hands while trying to look older than his years allowed. Amy, 14 and fierce, kept her arm around 10-year-old Lisa, who hadn't stopped crying since yesterday. Kevin and Ben flanked their mother on either side, 12 and 8 years old respectively, not understanding the full weight of what was happening, but sensing that something precious was slipping away. 6-year-old Sophie pressed close to Claire's. leg, thumb in her mouth for the first time in 2 years, while the 4-year-old twins, Jake and Luke, played with toy cars on the courthouse steps, blissfully unaware that they were about to lose the only home they'd ever known. Marcus had been watching the family from across the square, his chest tight with something that felt like grief mixed with anger. He knew Claire from the diner, knew her coffee was always hot, and her smile was always genuine even when she looked tired enough to fall over. He knew Tommy from the times he'd had to talk to him about driving that old pickup too fast on the county roads. Good kid just trying to help his mother with errands and responsibilities that should have belonged to a grown man. He knew all of them, really. The way you know people in a small town, where everybody's business is everybody's burden and everybody's joy is shared, like Sunday dinner. What Marcus didn't know was why he'd come here today. His own bank account had more dust than dollars. His own future looked about as certain as a weather forecast in tornado season. The sheriff's department ran on grants that kept getting smaller and hopes that kept getting thinner, and Marcus lived in a 1-bedroom apartment above the station that he rented from the county for less than it was worth, because nobody else wanted to live that close to the drunk tank and the sound of police radios crackling through the night. He had no business being here, no reason to torture himself by watching a good family get scattered to the wind like dandelion seeds. He should have been back at the station, filing reports or checking on the Henderson place where teenagers liked to park and drink beer they were too young to buy. He should have been anywhere but here, watching Judge Harold Peterson adjust his glasses and clear his throat in preparation for words that would change 9 lives forever. But sometimes a man finds himself in a place he can't explain, drawn by forces he doesn't understand, standing at a crossroads he didn't know he was approaching. Sometimes the moment chooses you before you choose the moment, and all you can do is decide whether to run towards something or away from it. The auctioneer was a thin man with a voice like gravel in a tin can, someone who'd driven down from Dallas and didn't know the difference between a farm and a tragedy. He spoke in rapid-fire numbers and legal terms, describing acreage and structures, mineral rights and water access, reducing the Daniels legacy to bullet points on a typed sheet. The crowd was small, but the interest was real. Developers from Austin who saw subdivision potential, neighboring farmers who needed more grazing land, and Frank Garrison, who owned the largest ranch in 3 counties and collected struggling properties like some men collected stamps. Garrison stood near the front, arms crossed, wearing boots that cost more than most people's monthly rent and a hat that had never seen honest work. He had the easy confidence of a man who'd never wondered where his next meal was coming from, never laid awake at night listening to his children cough and wondering if he could afford the doctor visit. Marcus had dealt with Garrison before, usually when his hired hands got too drunk and too loud at the roadhouse out on Highway 6. The man was legal, but not always ethical, smart, but not always kind. And today he looked like he was shopping for a bargain rather than witnessing a family's heartbreak. The bidding started low, as auctions do, feeling its way forward like a blind man in an unfamiliar room. A few half-hearted raises from farmers who knew they couldn't afford what they were bidding on but felt obligated to try. Garrison waited, patient as a hawk watching a field mouse, letting others exhaust their resources before he made his move. Marcus could see the calculation in his eyes, the cold mathematics of acquisition and profit, and something hot and uncomfortable twisted in his stomach. Claire Daniels hadn't moved from her spot near the oak tree, her children still arranged around her like a protective circle. She wasn't watching the bidding, couldn't bring herself to watch strangers put price tags on her memories. Instead, she stared out across the square toward the diner where she'd be returning to work tomorrow. If she still had a job, if her boss could find someone to cover her shifts while she figured out where 8 children were going to sleep tonight. The numbers climbed slowly, grudgingly, reaching amounts that made the smaller bidders shake their heads and step back. 20,000, 30, 45. Garrison raised his hand with the casual indifference of a man ordering coffee, pushing the price higher with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you have deeper pockets than anyone else in the room. Marcus felt his hands clench into fists at his sides. He thought about Claire's coffee, always refilled without being asked. He thought about Tommy trying to be the man of the house at 16, about Amy's fierce protectiveness of her younger siblings, about the twins playing with their toy cars while their world crumbled around them. He thought about David Daniels, who'd worked himself to the bone trying to provide for his family and died, knowing he was leaving them vulnerable to moments exactly like this one. 50,000. 60. The auctioneer's voice seemed to echo off the courthouse walls, each number a hammer blow against hope. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Garrison bid with the mechanical precision of a man who'd done this before, who knew exactly how high he needed to go to discourage competition. Marcus could see the resignation settling over the smaller crowd, the moment when people realized they were witnessing something they couldn't prevent. $70,000, going once. Marcus stepped forward without conscious thought, his voice cutting through the humid air like a blade through silk. 75,000. The words hung in the silence that followed, surprising everyone, including Marcus himself. Heads turned, whispers started, and somewhere behind him he heard Deputy Martinez mutter something that sounded like a prayer or a curse. Garrison's eyes found Marcus across the crowd, narrow and calculating, trying to assess this unexpected competition. Judge Peterson looked confused, glancing between Marcus and his notes as if trying to figure out if sheriffs were allowed to bid at county auctions. The auctioneer, oblivious to the local dynamics, simply nodded and continued his chant. I have 75,000. Do I hear 80? Garrison's hand went up almost immediately. 80,000. Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs, felt sweat that had nothing to do with the Texas heat trickling down his back. He had no idea where $75,000 was going to come from, much less 80 or 90 or whatever this was going to take. His savings account had maybe $3,000 on a good day, his credit was decent but not miraculous, and his salary barely covered his own modest expenses. But sometimes a man reaches a moment where logic has to step aside and let something deeper take the wheel. Sometimes you find yourself standing in front of a mountain you can't climb, holding tools you don't have, facing a challenge that defies every practical consideration, and you take the step anyway, because not taking it would mean losing something more valuable than money or security or common sense. 85,000, Marcus heard himself say, his voice steadier than he felt. The crowd was fully engaged now, sensing drama in the way that small-town people do when something unexpected disrupts the usual rhythm of predictable days. This wasn't just about real estate anymore. This was David versus Goliath, played out on courthouse steps, with everyone present understanding that they were witnessing something that would be talked about in coffee shops and church fellowship halls for years to come. Garrison turned to face Marcus directly, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to genuine interest. "You got that kind of money, Sheriff?" he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. It wasn't really a question. It was a challenge, a public calling out designed to expose Marcus as someone who was bidding with dreams instead of dollars. Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "Guess we'll find out." 90,000. Garrison said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife through butter. The silence that followed Garrison's bid felt heavy as storm clouds, pregnant with possibilities and weighted with consequences that would ripple far beyond this single moment. Marcus stood frozen in that space between courage and catastrophe, knowing that the next words out of his mouth would either launch him towards something extraordinary or spectacular failure. There was no middle ground, no safe harbor of maybe or perhaps. This was the kind of moment that divided a man's life into before and after, the kind of crossroads where you either became the person you were meant to be or forever wondered what might have been. $100,000. The words left Marcus's mouth with a finality that surprised him, carrying the weight of absolute commitment. Around him, the crowd shifted and murmured, a ripple of shock spreading outward like stones thrown into still water. $100,000 was more than most people in Millfield County saw in 2 years of honest work. More than the annual budget for half the county departments. More than any reasonable person would bid for property they couldn't afford. But Marcus wasn't feeling particularly reasonable. He was feeling something else entirely. Something that had to do with Claire Daniels standing motionless under that oak tree. Something about 8 children who deserved better than watching their world get auctioned off to the highest bidder. Something about the kind of man he wanted to be when he looked at himself in the mirror tomorrow morning. Garrison's confident smile faltered for the first time. He studied Marcus with the intensity of a poker player trying to read a bluff, searching for signs of weakness or uncertainty. What he saw instead was a man who had crossed some internal line, who had moved beyond the realm of careful calculation into territory where different rules applied. "You're making a mistake, Sheriff," Garrison said, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure everyone heard. "That property's got problems you don't know about. Drainage issues, fence repairs, probably needs a new roof. You sure you want to get in over your head?" Marcus felt something shift inside him, something that had been building pressure for months, of watching good people struggle while others profited from their pain. "I'm already in over my head, Garrison. Might as well make it count for something." The auctioneer looked between the two men like a referee at a boxing match, uncertain whether to continue or call for a timeout. Judge Peterson leaned forward, his brow furrowed with concern. "Sheriff Thompson, I need to ask, do you have the financial means to honor this bid? Because if you can't complete the purchase, there will be legal consequences." It was a fair question, the kind of practical inquiry that any responsible official should make. Marcus appreciated the judge's position, understood the legal requirements and the need for due diligence. What he didn't have was a good answer. At least not one that would satisfy a courtroom or a bank loan officer. "Your Honor," Marcus said, removing his hat and holding it in both hands, "I give you my word that I'll make good on this bid. I don't know exactly how yet, but I'll figure it out." It wasn't the answer Judge Peterson wanted to hear. It wasn't the answer anyone wanted to hear, including Marcus himself. But it was the only honest response he could give. And in a world that seemed increasingly short on honest responses, maybe that was worth something. Garrison shook his head, a mixture of disgust and disbelief crossing his features. "This is ridiculous. The man's bidding with money he doesn't have. I call for verification of funds before this goes any further." The judge nodded slowly. "That's a reasonable request, Mr. Garrison. Sheriff Thompson, I'm going to need some kind of financial documentation before I can accept your bid." Marcus felt the moment slipping away, felt reality reasserting itself with the cold precision of legal requirements and practical limitations. He had no documentation to provide, no bank statements that would support a $100,000 purchase, no miracle waiting in his back pocket. What he had was determination and good intentions, which had never been legal tender in any jurisdiction he knew of. But sometimes, when you're standing at the edge of impossible, help comes from directions you never thought to look. "Judge Peterson, if I may." The voice belonged to Eleanor Martinez, Rick's grandmother, and the closest thing Millfield County had to royalty. At 83, she commanded respect through a combination of longevity, wisdom, and the kind of moral authority that comes from living through depression and war and drought and still believing in the fundamental goodness of human nature. She owned the largest bank in 3 counties, had more money than anyone really knew, and used both her wealth and influence with the careful precision of a surgeon. She made her way through the crowd with the assistance of a carved wooden cane, moving slowly but purposefully toward the front of the gathering. People stepped aside naturally, creating a path without being asked, the way water parts around a stone. "Mrs. Martinez," Judge Peterson said, rising slightly from his chair. "What can I do for you?" Eleanor stopped next to Marcus, close enough that he could smell her lavender perfume and see the sharp intelligence in her dark eyes. "I'd like to co-sign Sheriff Thompson's bid, if that's legally permissible." The words hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Eleanor Martinez co-signing a $100,000 bid was like the Federal Reserve backing a lemonade stand. It transformed the entire transaction from questionable to absolutely solid. She had the kind of wealth that turned impossible into inevitable, the kind of reputation that made banks compete for her business rather than the other way around. Marcus stared at her in shock. "Mrs. Martinez, I can't ask you to—" "You didn't ask," she interrupted gently but firmly. "I offered. There's a difference, young man, and it's an important one." Garrison's face went through several expressions. In rapid succession: surprise, calculation, frustration, and finally resignation. He knew Eleanor Martinez's reputation, knew her financial capacity, and knew that continuing to bid against her backing would be expensive and ultimately futile. "Mrs. Martinez," Garrison said, attempting diplomacy, "with all due respect, this seems like an emotional decision rather than a sound business investment. Maybe you should take some time to think about—" "Mr. Garrison," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that had been developed over 8 decades of not suffering fools gladly. "I've been making business decisions since before you were born. I think I can handle this one." The auctioneer cleared his throat, eager to move the proceedings forward. "Do I hear 110,000? Garrison looked around the crowd, calculating odds and measuring support. What he saw was a community that had already chosen sides, faces that reflected not just interest, but investment in the outcome. These weren't neutral observers anymore. They were witnesses to something that mattered, participants in a moment that would define not just one family's future, but the character of their entire community. "No further bids," Garrison said finally, stepping back with the grace of a man who knew when he was beaten. "Going once," the auctioneer called, "going twice." His gavel rose, paused for a dramatic moment, then fell with a sharp crack that seemed to echo off every building in the square. "Sold to Sheriff Thompson for $100,000. The sound that rose from the crowd was unlike anything Marcus had ever heard. Part cheer, part sigh of relief, part something deeper that had to do with justice and hope, and the belief that sometimes good things happen to people who deserved them. It was the sound of a community exhaling together, of collective tension being released in a wave of approval and celebration. Marcus felt his knees go weak, felt the full weight of what he'd just committed to settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. $100,000, property that needed work, children who needed homes, responsibilities that stretched far beyond anything he'd ever imagined taking on. He had no plan, no clear path forward, no idea how he was going to transform this moment of impulse into something sustainable and real. But when he looked across the square and saw Claire Daniels drop to her knees, saw her children surround her in a huddle of tears and uncertain laughter, saw hope returning to faces that had been marked by loss and fear, when he saw all of that, Marcus knew he'd made the right choice, regardless of the consequences. Eleanor Martinez squeezed his arm gently. "Don't look so terrified, Sheriff. We'll figure it out together. Mrs. Martinez, I don't know how I'll ever repay you for this." She smiled, the kind of smile that held decades of wisdom and experience. Who said anything about repaying? Sometimes the best investments are the ones that pay dividends in ways you can't measure with money. Deputy Martinez appeared at Marcus's side, shaking his head in amazement. Boss, I don't know whether to arrest you for public insanity or nominate you for sainthood. Maybe both, Marcus replied, watching as the crowd began to disperse, people heading back to their regular Tuesday routines, but carrying with them the story of something extraordinary that had happened on courthouse steps in the middle of an ordinary summer morning. Claire Daniels was walking toward him now, her 8 children trailing behind like ducklings following their mother. Her face was streaked with tears, but her eyes were clear, filled with something that looked like gratitude mixed with disbelief. Tommy walked beside her, no longer trying to look older than his 16 years, just looking like a teenager who'd been carrying too much weight for too long and was finally allowed to set it down. "Sheriff Thompson," Claire said when she reached him, her voice thick with emotion, "I don't understand what just happened, but I want you to know." "Mrs. Daniels," Marcus interrupted gently, "we've got plenty of time to talk about what happened. Right now, let's focus on what happens next." What happened next was uncertainty, wrapped in hope, questions without clear answers, and the beginning of something that none of them could have imagined when they'd woken up that Tuesday morning. What happened next was the first chapter of a story that would be told and retold until it became legend, the kind of tale that small towns hold onto like treasures, polishing with each telling until they shine like gold. But first, there were practical matters to address, papers to sign, arrangements to make, and 8 children who needed to understand that their world had changed again, but this time in a direction that pointed toward possibility rather than loss. There were legal requirements and financial obligations, community support to organize, and plans to make. Most importantly, there was a sheriff who had just discovered that sometimes the most important decisions are the ones that make no sense at all, and a family who was about to learn that miracles sometimes come disguised as ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The story was just beginning, and already Marcus could sense that it was going to be bigger than anything he'd ever been part of before. Bigger and more complicated and more wonderful than he'd ever dared to imagine. But that was tomorrow's challenge. Today, he'd done something that mattered. Today, he'd chosen to be the kind of man who stepped forward when stepping back would have been easier. Today, he'd discovered that sometimes the most expensive things in life, like hope and dignity and the chance to make a difference, are also the most valuable. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, you get the chance to pay for them with everything you have and discover that you're richer than you ever imagined possible. 3 days after the auction, Marcus stood in the doorway of the Daniels farmhouse, holding a clipboard and wearing an expression that belonged somewhere between bewildered and terrified. The morning sun streamed through windows that needed washing, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the stale air. Behind him, the screen door hung crooked on its hinges, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the sound of children's voices mixing with the complaint of old floorboards under restless feet. This was supposed to be the easy part. Walk through the property, assess what needed fixing, make a plan. Simple, straightforward, the kind of methodical approach that had served him well during his years in law enforcement. Look at the evidence, evaluate the situation, determine the next logical step. Except nothing about this situation felt logical, and the evidence suggested he'd bought himself a mountain of problems that would take years and resources he didn't have to solve. The house itself was solid enough, built in the 1940s, when contractors still believed in foundations that would outlast the families who lived above them. But solid didn't mean perfect, and Marcus's untrained eye could spot dozens of issues that ranged from cosmetic to concerning. The roof showed signs of wear, with a few shingles missing and gutters that sagged under the weight of accumulated debris. The front porch steps were warped, creating gaps that could catch an unwary foot, and the paint on the exterior walls had faded and peeled until the house looked like it was slowly shedding its skin. Inside was a different story entirely. The Daniels family had clearly done their best to maintain what they could with limited resources, but 3 years of medical bills and mounting financial pressure had forced them to defer maintenance that was now demanding attention. The kitchen faucet dripped with metronomic persistence, each drop marking time like a liquid countdown. The hardwood floors were scuffed and worn thin in high-traffic areas, and several windows refused to stay open without the support of wooden blocks or folded cardboard. Marcus made notes on his clipboard, trying to organize the overwhelming list of repairs into categories that made sense: urgent, important, eventually necessary, completely beyond his current skills or budget. The last category was growing at an alarming rate, filled with items like electrical updates, plumbing repairs, and HVAC maintenance that would require professional intervention and professional prices. Claire appeared in the kitchen doorway, carrying a steaming mug of coffee and wearing the kind of tired smile that suggested she'd been up since before dawn, dealing with 8 children's worth of morning chaos. She'd pulled her hair back in a practical ponytail and wore jeans that showed evidence of recent encounters with various household disasters. Despite everything she'd been through, there was something resilient in her posture, something that spoke of determination forged in the furnace of necessity. "How bad is it?" she asked, nodding toward the clipboard that had become Marcus's constant companion over the past 3 days. Marcus set down his pen and accepted the coffee gratefully. "Well, the foundation is solid, which is more than I can say for my financial planning skills." Claire laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to brighten the tired kitchen. "Mr. Thompson, I've been living here for 15 years. I know every creaky board and leaky pipe in this place. You don't have to pretend it's not a mess." "Marcus," he corrected, "and you're right, it's a mess, but it's a fixable mess, which is different than an impossible mess." She studied him over her own coffee mug, her eyes holding the kind of assessment that mothers develop after years of sorting truth from wishful thinking. "You sure about that? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you bought yourself a whole lot of expensive problems." Marcus had been asking himself the same question for 3 days, usually around 3 in the morning, when sleep refused to come and doubt crept in like smoke under a door. What had he been thinking? What kind of responsible adult commits to a $100,000 purchase without a plan, without savings, without any clear idea of how to transform good intentions into practical solutions? But then he'd remember Claire's face when the gavel fell, remember 8 children who'd been hours away from homelessness, remember the way the community had rallied around something that mattered. He'd remember that sometimes the most important decisions weren't made with calculators and spreadsheets, but with something deeper, something that had to do with the kind of person you wanted to be when the easy choices ran out. "Honestly," Marcus said, leaning against the kitchen counter that tilted slightly to the left, "I have no idea what I'm doing. But I figure that puts me in good company because most people don't know what they're doing either. They just pretend better." Before Claire could respond, the sound of running feet announced the arrival of 12-year-old Kevin, who burst through the kitchen door with the kind of energy that suggested either excitement or emergency. His face was flushed and his hair stuck up at impossible angles, giving him the appearance of someone who'd been struck by lightning and lived to tell about it. "Sheriff Marcus," Kevin said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "There's a man outside asking about the property taxes, and he's got papers, and he looks really official and maybe kind of angry." Marcus felt his stomach drop. Property taxes. Of course, He'd been so focused on the purchase price and the immediate repairs that he'd forgotten about the ongoing financial obligations that came with land ownership. Tax assessments, insurance requirements, utility connections, all the mundane but essential details that separated homeowners from people who'd made expensive mistakes. "Did he say what he wanted specifically?" Marcus asked, already moving toward the front door. "Something about delinquent payments and county liens," Kevin replied, following close behind. "Also, he has a really shiny car." The man standing in the front yard did indeed have a shiny car, a black sedan that looked like it had been detailed that morning and driven directly from an office building where serious financial matters were discussed by people wearing expensive suits. The man himself fit the same pattern: pressed shirt, narrow tie, briefcase that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month. He had the appearance of someone who dealt in numbers and deadlines, someone for whom human stories were secondary to legal requirements and administrative efficiency. "You Sheriff Thompson?" the man asked, consulting a tablet computer with the kind of focused attention that suggested bad news was about to be delivered with digital precision. "That's right. And you are?" "Gerald Finch, County Tax Assessor's Office. We need to discuss the tax situation on this property." He tapped his tablet screen. "Shows here that taxes haven't been paid in 18 months. Total amount owed, including penalties and interest, comes to $12,467. The number hit Marcus like a physical blow. $12,000. On top of the $100,000 he'd already committed to Eleanor Martinez, plus the unknown thousands he'd need for repairs, plus his own living expenses and the financial needs of 9 people who were depending on him to somehow make this work. 18 months? Marcus asked, though he knew the answer before Finch responded. "Family fell behind during the medical situation. We tried to work with them, but—" Finch shrugged, the gesture containing volumes about bureaucratic limitations and individual tragedies. "Policy is policy. New owner assumes all tax obligations. Payment is due within 30 days or the county initiates foreclosure proceedings." Behind Marcus, he could hear Claire's sharp intake of breath. 30 days to find $12,000, or watch the property get taken away just as surely as if he'd never bid at all. It was almost funny, in the way that disasters sometimes are, when they pile up faster than logic can process them. "Is there any kind of payment plan available?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Finch consulted his tablet again. "For amounts over 10,000, payment plans require a 50% down payment and completion within 6 months. Interest continues to accrue during the payment period. $6,000 in 30 days, plus interest, plus everything else." Marcus felt the weight of impossibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. This was the moment when good intentions collided with financial reality, when the gap between wanting to help and being able to help became a chasm too wide to cross. "I'll need to review my options," Marcus said finally. 30 days, Finch repeated, closing his tablet with a decisive snap. "After that, it goes to the county attorney's office and the situation becomes significantly more complicated." Marcus watched the shiny car disappear down the gravel driveway, leaving behind a dust cloud and the kind of silence that follows the delivery of unwelcome news. He could feel Claire standing behind him, could sense the weight of her hopes and fears pressing against his back like a physical force. "Well," Claire said finally, her voice carefully neutral, "that's a problem." Marcus turned to face her, seeing his own concerns reflected in her eyes. "Yeah, it's a problem, but problems have solutions, even when we can't see them yet." $12,000 in 30 days? Marcus, that's not a problem. That's a miracle wrapped in a mathematical impossibility. She was right, of course. $12,000 might as well have been 12 million for all the access Marcus had to that kind of money. His savings account, which had seemed adequate for a bachelor sheriff living in a rented apartment, looked pathetic when measured against the needs of a 40-acre farm and 8 children. His credit was decent but not spectacular, and banks didn't generally approve loans for men who'd recently committed to financial obligations that exceeded their annual salary. But standing there in the morning sun, looking at a house that needed work and a family that needed hope, Marcus found himself thinking about something Eleanor Martinez had said at the courthouse. Sometimes the best investments are the ones that pay dividends in ways you can't measure with money. Maybe the solution wasn't about finding $12,000. Maybe it was about finding something more valuable than money. "Claire," Marcus said slowly, an idea beginning to form in the back of his mind. "What did your husband do for work before he got sick?" "David, he was a contractor. Did everything from roofing to electrical work, plumbing, carpentry. Man could fix anything with moving parts and most things without them." "Did he have tools, equipment?" Claire nodded toward the large barn that stood behind the house. "Everything's still out there. I couldn't bring myself to sell it, and honestly, nobody wanted to buy tools from a widow. Bad luck or something." Marcus felt the pieces of an idea clicking together like tumblers in a lock. Tools meant capability. Capability meant the possibility of turning labor into income, of transforming problems into opportunities. If David Daniels had been a contractor, if his equipment was still functional, if Marcus could figure out how to use what was available instead of buying what he couldn't afford. "Would you mind if I took a look at what's in the barn?" The barn was larger than it appeared from the outside, a spacious structure that had been built to accommodate serious work. David Daniels had organized his tools with the kind of systematic precision that spoke of professional pride and practical efficiency. Hand tools hung from pegboard walls in neat rows, each item outlined in marker to show its proper place. Power tools were arranged on sturdy workbenches, and extension cords were coiled and hung from hooks like sleeping snakes. Marcus walked through the space slowly, taking inventory of equipment that represented years of accumulated expertise and investment. Table saw, miter saw, circular saws, reciprocating saws, drill presses and hand drills, sanders and planers, levels and squares and measuring devices he couldn't immediately identify. It was the workshop of someone who took craftsmanship seriously, someone who understood that good work required good tools, and that good tools deserved proper care. "David spent 20 years collecting all this," Claire said, running her hand along the edge of a workbench worn smooth by use. "Said a man's tools were the measure of his commitment to doing things right." Marcus picked up a hammer, feeling the weight of it in his hand, noting the way the handle showed the smooth wear patterns of regular use. "Did he teach any of the kids? Tommy, maybe?" "Tommy knows his way around basic repairs, but David got sick before he could pass along the real skills. Always said he'd have time to teach the boys properly when they got a little older." Her voice carried the weight of plans interrupted, futures that had been derailed by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Marcus set down the hammer and turned to face Claire directly. "What if we used this equipment to generate the money we need for the taxes?" "How do you mean?" "Contracting work. Small jobs around the county. There's always demand for reliable repair work, and from what I can see, your husband left behind everything we'd need to get started." Claire looked skeptical, and Marcus couldn't blame her. "Marcus, you're a sheriff, not a contractor. You know anything about construction work?" "I know enough to be dangerous, which is more than I knew about property ownership 3 days ago." Marcus gestured toward the organized workspace around them. "Look, I'm not talking about building houses or major renovations, but fence repairs, deck maintenance, maybe some basic electrical and plumbing work. Jobs that need doing but aren't complicated enough to require master craftsmen." "And you think that would generate $12,000 in 30 days? Marcus pulled out his phone and opened the calculator app. Let's say we could average $200 a day in revenue. That's $6,000 a month, or about what we'd need for the tax payment if we could get started immediately. Claire was quiet for a long moment, considering the mathematics and the possibilities. $200 a day is a lot of money for part-time work. You're right, it is, but I wouldn't be doing this part-time. I'd be taking vacation time, personal days, whatever it takes to make this work, and I wouldn't be doing it alone. What do you mean? Marcus walked over to the barn's main door and looked out across the farmyard where several of the Daniels' children were playing. Tommy was throwing a football to Kevin, while Amy sat on the porch steps reading a book and keeping one eye on the younger ones. It was a scene of normalcy, of children being children despite the uncertainty that surrounded their future. Tommy's 16, right? Old enough to work, old enough to learn skills that'll serve him well regardless of what happens next. And Amy looks like she could organize a project if someone gave her the chance. Kevin's got energy that could be channeled into something productive. Claire followed his gaze, watching her children with the mixture of pride and concern that seemed to be the default expression of single mothers everywhere. You're talking about putting my kids to work to save their own home. I'm talking about giving your kids a chance to be part of the solution instead of just witnesses to the problem. There's a difference. It was a fine distinction, but Marcus believed it was an important one. Children who felt helpless in the face of adult problems often carried that sense of powerlessness into their adult lives. But children who learned that challenges could be met with effort and creativity, that families could work together to overcome obstacles, those children grew up knowing they had agency in their own lives. You really think this could work? Claire asked. Marcus looked around the barn again, mentally cataloguing the resources available and trying to match them against the needs he'd observed during his 3 days of property assessment. It wasn't just about the Daniels farm anymore. Every property in Millfield County showed signs of deferred maintenance, of repairs that homeowners needed but couldn't afford or couldn't do themselves. The drought had damaged roofs and foundations, the wind had torn down fences and damaged siding, and the economic pressures affecting everyone meant that professional contractors were either too expensive or too busy to handle smaller jobs. I think we've got the tools and the motivation, Marcus said finally. Question is whether we can find enough work to make it worthwhile. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of a vehicle coming up the driveway announced another visitor. This time it wasn't a shiny government sedan, but a dusty pickup truck that looked like it had been working for a living. The driver was a woman in her 50s, wearing work clothes and a determined expression, someone Marcus recognized but couldn't immediately place. That's Janet Morrison, Claire said. Owns the Double M Ranch about 10 miles south. Wonder what brings her out here. Janet Morrison approached with the direct manner of someone accustomed to dealing with practical problems and limited time. She nodded to Claire and extended a work-calloused hand to Marcus. Sheriff Thompson heard about what you did at the auction. That was a good thing. Thank you, Mrs. Morrison. What can I do for you? Actually, I'm hoping I can do something. For you. Word gets around fast in a county this size, and I heard you might be looking for contracting work. She gestured toward her truck, which Marcus could now see was loaded with fence posts and wire. Got about a mile of fence line that needs replacing. Been putting it off because the quotes I've gotten are more than I can justify for what amounts to maintenance work. Marcus felt his heart rate increase. What kind of timeline are you looking at? Soon as possible. Had 3 head of cattle get through a gap last week, and I can't afford to lose any more livestock to damaged fencing. Janet pulled a folded paper from her shirt pocket, drew up a rough estimate of materials needed and the scope of work. Fair warning, it's not glamorous, but it pays honest money for honest work. Marcus accepted the paper and scanned the handwritten details. Materials would cost about $800, and Janet was offering $1,500 for completed. Installation, $700 profit for what looked like 3 or 4 days of hard work. It wasn't enough to solve the tax problem by itself, but it was a start, a proof of concept that could lead to other opportunities. "Mrs. Morrison," Marcus said, extending his hand again, "you've got yourself a contractor." "Excellent. When can you start?" Marcus looked at Claire, who was watching the exchange with growing excitement and concern in equal measure. "Day after tomorrow, if that works for you. Going to need tomorrow to organize equipment and crew." "Crew?" "Aye, my partner," Marcus said, nodding toward Claire, "and a few apprentices who are eager to learn the trade." After Janet Morrison left, Marcus and Claire stood in the barn, surrounded by tools and possibilities, both of them trying to process the sudden shift from theoretical planning to concrete commitment. Marcus had just committed to completing a fencing project he'd never done before, using equipment he barely knew how to operate, with the help of people who had even less experience than he did. "You realize," Claire said slowly, "that we have no idea what we're doing." "Yep, and that if we mess this up, we'll lose Janet Morrison's business and probably any chance of getting other work in the county." "That's also true. And that we have exactly 1 day to figure out how to install a mile of fencing without embarrassing ourselves or creating a safety hazard." Marcus grinned, feeling the kind of nervous energy that comes with jumping off cliffs and hoping you'll figure out how to fly on the way down. "Claire, 3 days ago I bought a farm I couldn't afford to help a family I barely knew. Yesterday I found out I owe $12,000 in taxes I don't have. Today a customer just walked into our barn and offered us paying work. At this point, I'm pretty sure we're making it up as we go along anyway." Claire looked around the barn, at her husband's carefully organized tools, at the evidence of years of expertise and craftsmanship. Then she looked out toward the house, where her 8 children were depending on adults to somehow make everything work out despite impossible odds. David always said that the difference between amateurs and professionals wasn't knowledge. It was willingness to learn fast and fix mistakes quickly. Sounds like a smart man. He was. And he also said that the most important tool in any workshop was the determination to keep working until the job was done right. Marcus nodded, understanding that they were talking about more than fence installation. They were talking about commitment, about the willingness to persist through uncertainty and inexperience towards something that mattered more than comfort or convenience. "So," he said, "are we doing this?" Claire walked over to the pegboard, a wall, and removed a tape measure, checking its mechanism with the automatic competence of someone who'd watched a craftsman work for 15 years. "We're doing this, but first we're going to spend the rest of today learning everything we can about fence installation, and tomorrow we're going to practice on the section behind the barn that's been falling down for 2 years. Practice run. Practice run, because if we're going to fail, better to fail on our own property than on Janet Morrison's." Marcus felt something shift inside him, something that had to do with partnership and shared purpose. For 3 days, he'd been carrying the weight of this decision alone, wondering if good intentions were enough to bridge the gap between what he wanted to do and what he was capable of doing. Now he had an answer. Good intentions weren't enough by themselves, but good intentions combined with determination, resourcefulness, and the willingness to learn from people who knew more than you did. That might be enough to build something extraordinary. "One more thing," Claire said, her voice carrying a note of warning. "Tommy's going to want to help, and he's going to think he knows more than he does because he's watched his father work. Amy's going to want to organize everything, which might be helpful, but could also slow us down. Kevin's going to be enthusiastic, but easily distracted. The younger ones are going to want to be involved, even though they're too little for construction work." "Sounds like a normal family business to me." This isn't a normal family business, Marcus. This is 8 children whose entire future depends on whether 2 adults with no relevant experience can figure out how to become contractors in 30 days. Marcus picked up David Daniels' hammer again, feeling its weight and balance. Claire, I've been a sheriff for 8 years. You know what the biggest part of that job is. It's not chasing criminals or solving mysteries. It's showing up when people need help and figuring out how to be useful even when you don't have all the answers. He set the hammer down and turned to face her directly. I don't know if we can do this. I don't know if we can generate $12,000 in 30 days, or if I can learn enough about construction to avoid getting us all electrocuted. But I know that 3 days ago, 8 children were about to lose their home, and today they've still got a roof over their heads, and adults who are willing to work themselves to death to keep it that way. Claire was quiet for a moment, processing everything that had happened and everything that still needed to happen. Then she smiled, not the tired smile she'd been wearing for months, but something brighter and more determined. All right, Sheriff Thompson, let's go learn how to build fences. As they walked back toward the house, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling around him like a familiar coat. It was heavier than his badge, more complex than any case he'd ever worked, and more important than anything he'd ever committed to in his life. But for the first time since the auction, he felt like they had a plan that was based on more than hope and good intentions. They had tools, they had motivation, and they had each other. In a world that often felt short on all three, that seemed like enough to start with. Tomorrow they would begin the transformation from desperate improvisation to something that might actually work. Tomorrow they would find out if determination could substitute for experience, if family teamwork could overcome individual limitations, and if love really was strong enough to move mountains, one fence post at a time. The practice fence section behind the barn looked like it had been attacked by a combination of termites, weather, and time itself. Posts leaned at drunken angles, wires sagged toward the ground in loose loops, and several sections had given up entirely, leaving gaps wide enough for livestock to wander through without breaking stride. It was, Marcus realized, the perfect training ground for people who needed to learn fencing skills quickly, without the pressure of paying customers watching their mistakes. Tommy stood beside him, holding a post-hole digger with the kind of confidence that comes from having watched a master craftsman work, even if you've never done the work yourself. At 16, he had his father's build and his mother's determined expression, plus the restless energy of someone eager to prove he could handle adult responsibilities. Amy had appointed herself project coordinator, armed with a notebook and a measuring tape, documenting everything with the thoroughness of someone who understood that knowledge was power and organization was survival. Dad always said the most important part of any fence was what you couldn't see, Tommy said, indicating the ground where invisible post holes would determine whether the entire project succeeded or failed. Posts got to be deep enough and straight, enough to handle whatever stress gets put on them. Marcus nodded, appreciating the wisdom, even as he wondered how David Daniels had managed to make it sound so simple. According to the research they'd done the night before, fence posts needed to be buried at least 2 feet deep, preferably deeper in sandy soil or areas prone to frost heave. They needed to be perfectly vertical, properly spaced, and set in concrete that would cure evenly and provide decades of reliable support. On paper, it seemed straightforward. In practice, with rocky Texas soil and equipment he was still learning to operate, Marcus suspected it would be significantly more complicated. "All right," he said, consulting the rough diagram Amy had sketched based on measurements they'd taken the previous evening. "First post goes here. Tommy, you want to show me how your dad did this?" Tommy positioned the post-hole digger with careful precision, checking and rechecking his alignment before beginning to dig. The first few scoops came up easily, revealing dark soil that crumbled nicely in their hands. Marcus felt a surge of optimism that lasted exactly until Tommy hit the first rock, a chunk of limestone about the size of a watermelon that had been sitting 2 feet underground waiting to complicate their lives. "Well," Tommy said, pausing to wipe sweat from his forehead, "this is where it gets interesting." Interesting turned out to be an understatement. The rock was too big to dig around and too well embedded to simply lift out. It required a combination of tools Marcus had never used together, plus a level of patience he wasn't sure he possessed. Tommy attacked the problem with the methodical approach of someone who'd absorbed lessons by observation, using a pry bar and pickaxe to gradually work around the obstruction, while Amy took notes on technique and timing. Kevin appeared at Marcus's elbow, drawn by the sounds of manual labor and the possibility of being useful. At 12, he had the boundless enthusiasm of someone who viewed physical challenges as entertainment rather than work. "Can I try?" Marcus was about to say no, to explain that post-hole digging required experience and caution, when he caught sight of Claire watching from the kitchen window. She was holding baby Luke while Sophie clung to her leg, both of them observing the work crew with the kind of intense focus that suggested they understood this project was about more than fence repair. "Sure," Marcus said, moving aside to give Kevin room. "But listen to Tommy's instructions, and if he tells you to stop, you stop immediately." Kevin grabbed the post-hole digger with both hands and immediately discovered that enthusiasm was no substitute for technique. His first attempt sent dirt flying in all directions, including into his own face, while barely making a dent in the hole they were trying to deepen. Tommy grinned and moved to stand behind his younger brother, guiding his hands and showing him how to use leverage rather than pure force. "Feel that?" Tommy asked as they worked together. "You're fighting the dirt instead of working with it. Dad always said soil wants to move. You just got to convince it to move where you need it to go." Marcus watched the interaction with growing respect for Tommy's teaching ability and Kevin's willingness to learn. This wasn't just about digging holes anymore. It was about older siblings passing knowledge to younger ones, about family members supporting each other through challenges that required both individual skill and collective effort. Amy called from her position 20 feet away, where she was measuring distances and checking alignment. "Post spacing needs to be exact if we want the wire to have proper tension. Dad's notes say 8 feet on center for this type of fencing." The notes Amy referenced were pages from David Daniels' personal notebooks, filled with handwritten observations and sketches that revealed the accumulated wisdom of 20 years in construction. Claire had found them the previous evening while searching through boxes in the barn's office area, and they'd spent hours studying diagrams and calculations that transformed fence building from guesswork into science. By mid-morning, they'd managed to dig 4 post holes, each one teaching them something new about soil conditions, rock distribution, and the proper use of tools they were gradually learning to respect. Marcus's hands were blistered despite the work gloves he wore, and his back ached in places he'd forgotten existed, but the holes were straight, properly spaced, and deep enough to provide the foundation for a fence that would last. Claire emerged from the house carrying a pitcher of ice water and wearing the kind of smile that suggested she'd been enjoying the entertainment provided by watching adults and teenagers figure out manual labor through trial and error. "How's the crash course in construction going?" "Educational," Marcus replied, accepting a glass of water gratefully. "Your husband's notes are incredibly detailed. Man thought of everything." David was methodical about his work, said if you were going to do something, might as well do it right the first time because fixing mistakes was always more expensive than preventing them. Tommy looked up from the hole he was digging, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. "Mom, remember when Dad built the chicken coop and spent 2 days just planning the foundation? I thought he was being ridiculous, but that coop's still standing while the neighbors fell down in the last storm. That's the difference between building something and building something that lasts, Claire said. Your father understood that. Good work starts with good planning, and good planning starts with understanding what you're trying to accomplish. Marcus nodded, thinking about the fence project they'd committed to completing for Janet Morrison. A mile of fencing was significantly more complex than the practice section they were working on, requiring not just technical skills, but project management, time estimation, and the ability to maintain quality standards under pressure. Everything they learned here would be magnified by a factor of 10 when they started working on paying jobs. Amy approached with her notebook, consulting notes she'd been taking throughout the morning. At this rate, it's going to take us 6 hours to complete. 100-foot section. Janet Morrison's project is about 5,000 feet, which means 50 to 60 hours of work if we can maintain this pace. That's assuming we don't get faster as we gain experience, Tommy pointed out. Dad always said the first day of any project was the slowest because you're still figuring out the rhythm. Marcus appreciated Tommy's optimism, but he also knew that Janet Morrison's project would involve challenges they weren't facing in their practice session. Different soil conditions, uneven terrain, existing fence removal, and the pressure of working under the scrutiny of a paying customer who expected professional results. Every mistake here was a learning opportunity. Every mistake there would cost time, money, and credibility they couldn't afford to lose. The sound of another vehicle approaching interrupted their discussion. This time, it was Deputy Martinez in his patrol car, driving slowly up the gravel road with the kind of careful attention that suggested an official visit rather than a social call. Marcus felt his stomach tighten, wondering what new crisis was about to complicate their already complicated situation. Rick Martinez climbed out of the patrol car wearing his uniform and a concerned expression. He'd been Marcus's deputy for 3 years, long enough to develop the kind of professional relationship that occasionally crossed over into genuine friendship. Rick was steady, reliable, and possessed the rare ability to remain calm under pressure while still maintaining the sense of humor that made 12-hour shifts bearable. "Boss," Rick said, approaching the work area with the careful steps of someone trying not to track mud across a crime scene. "Sorry to interrupt, but we've got a situation that requires your attention." Marcus set down the post hole digger and brushed dirt from his hands. "What kind of situation?" "Frank Garrison filed a complaint with the county about unauthorized construction activity on this property. Claims you're operating a business without proper permits and zoning approval." The words hit Marcus like cold water. Frank Garrison, the man who'd tried to buy the Daniels property at auction, was apparently not content to let the matter rest. Now he was using legal technicalities to create problems that could shut down their contracting operation before it ever really started. "What specific violations is he claiming?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Rick consulted his notes. Commercial activity in a residential zone, business operation without county licensing, construction work without contractor certification, employment of minors in hazardous activities. He's basically throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. Claire moved closer, her maternal instincts activated by any threat to her children's involvement in the project. "Are my kids in trouble?" "Not directly," Rick replied. "But the county has to investigate any complaint about child welfare, especially when it involves potential safety hazards." Marcus felt anger building in his chest, the kind of righteous fury that came from watching bureaucratic weapons being used against people who were trying to solve problems rather than create them. Garrison had the resources to tie them up in legal proceedings for months, draining their time and energy while the tax deadline approached with mathematical certainty. "How long do we have before someone shows up to investigate?" "County inspector," will be here tomorrow morning. You'll need to demonstrate that any work being done is for personal property maintenance rather than commercial activity, and that proper safety protocols are being followed for any minors involved. Tommy stepped forward, his young face set in hard lines. This is our home. We're learning to fix our own fence. How is that illegal? It's not illegal, Rick assured him. But it's also not that simple when someone with resources decides to make trouble for you. Marcus looked around at the work they'd accomplished, at the tools they'd been learning to use, at the family that was depending on this project to generate the income they needed to keep their home. Everything they'd planned, everything they'd hoped for, was suddenly threatened by a man who apparently couldn't accept losing an auction to a sheriff with more determination than money. Rick, what exactly do we need to do to satisfy the inspector? Honestly, prove that this is educational rather than commercial. Family members learning skills for personal property maintenance, not employees being trained for a business operation. Amy looked up from her notebook, where she'd been writing furiously during the entire conversation. What if we're not employees? What if we're family members helping with property maintenance while learning valuable life skills? Marcus felt a spark of hope. Amy had inherited her father's methodical thinking and her mother's practical intelligence, plus the kind of creative problem-solving that came from growing up in a household where resources were limited, but imagination was not. Keep talking, he said. Well, this is our home now, right? And Sheriff Marcus is part of our family now, sort of, because he saved our home. So if family members are working together to maintain their own property, that's not a business. That's just normal family life. Claire smiled, the kind of proud expression that appeared when children demonstrated wisdom beyond their years. Amy's right. This is our home, and we're learning to take care of it properly. Nothing commercial about that. Rick nodded slowly. That could work, especially if you can demonstrate that the primary purpose is education and property maintenance rather than income generation. What about the Janet Morrison project? Marcus asked. We've already committed to that work. That's trickier. If you're doing work for pay, that's definitely commercial activity. Rick paused, thinking through the legal implications. Unless what? Unless it's a one-time favor for a neighbor, not an ongoing business operation. Lots of people help neighbors with projects in exchange for compensation. As long as you're not advertising services or seeking additional customers, it could be viewed as neighborly assistance rather than commercial contracting. Marcus felt the pieces of a solution beginning to form. They could continue their current work as family education and property maintenance. The Morrison project could be framed as helping a neighbor rather than operating a business. And if they were careful about how they approached additional opportunities, they might be able to generate the income they needed without triggering the kind of regulatory scrutiny that Garrison was trying to create. All right, Marcus said. Here's what we're going to do. Tomorrow, when the inspector arrives, he's going to see a family learning to maintain their own property. Tommy and Amy and Kevin are getting hands-on education in practical skills. The work we're doing is for our own benefit, on our own land. And the Morrison project? Neighborly assistance. Janet Morrison asked for help, and we're providing it as a favor, not as a business transaction. Claire looked skeptical. You think that'll be enough to satisfy the inspector? It has to be, Marcus replied, because the alternative is letting Garrison win by using bureaucracy as a weapon against people who are trying to improve their situation through honest work. Rick nodded approvingly. Boss, I think you've got the right approach. Just make sure everyone understands the story and sticks to it. Consistency is going to be key. After Rick left, the family gathered in the kitchen to discuss strategy and make sure everyone understood the situation they were facing. Marcus explained about Frank Garrison's complaint about the inspector's visit, and about the importance of presenting their work as education and property maintenance rather than commercial activity. Tommy listened with the intensity of someone who understood that adult problems could have serious consequences for young people. So we're not learning to be contractors, we're learning to take care of our own home. Exactly, Marcus said. And that's not even a lie. Everything we're learning here will help you maintain this property for years to come. Amy raised her hand like she was in school. What about my notebook? I've been documenting everything like it's a business project. Your notebook becomes a learning journal, Claire suggested, a documentation of skills you're acquiring and knowledge you're gaining about property maintenance. Kevin looked confused. But we are trying to make money, right? To pay the taxes? Marcus chose his words carefully. We're learning skills that might help us assist neighbors with projects they need completed. The focus is on education and community service, not profit. It was a fine distinction, but Marcus believed it was an honest one. They were a family, learning to work together, developing skills that would serve them regardless of future circumstances. The fact that those skills might also generate income was secondary to the primary purpose of education and self-sufficiency. Sophie, who had been listening from her position on Claire's lap, spoke up with the clarity that sometimes comes from 6-year-old logic. Are we in trouble? No, sweetheart, Claire assured her. Some people are just confused about what we're doing. And tomorrow a nice man is going to come visit so we can explain everything clearly. Marcus hoped it would be that simple. He hoped the inspector would be reasonable, that their explanations would be accepted, and that they could continue their work without further interference from Garrison or anyone else who might view their efforts as threatening rather than inspiring. But even if tomorrow brought new challenges, even if they had to modify their approach or find different ways to achieve their goals, Marcus knew they'd already accomplished something important. They'd brought a family together around a common purpose, given children meaningful roles in securing their own future, and demonstrated that determination combined with resourcefulness could overcome obstacles that seemed impossible at first glance. The practice fence behind the barn was nearly complete, 4 posts set straight and true, ready to support wire that would mark boundaries and contain livestock for years to come. It wasn't perfect, but it was solid, built with care and attention to detail that honored David Daniels's memory, while pointing toward a future that included his children learning the skills he'd hoped to teach them himself. Tomorrow would bring the inspector new challenges and the need to defend their right to work together as a family toward goals that mattered more than money or regulations. But tonight, they could look at what they'd accomplished and know that they were building something stronger than fence posts, something more durable than wire and concrete. They were building hope, one hole at a time, one lesson at a time, one family member at a time. And that was worth defending against anyone who tried to tear it down. The county inspector arrived at 7:30 in the morning, driving a white pickup truck with official emblems and carrying a clipboard that looked like it had seen more battles than victories. Harold Brewster was a man in his 50s who'd spent 25 years navigating the space between bureaucratic requirements and human realities, developing the kind of professional skepticism that came from witnessing every possible variation of good intentions gone wrong. He had grey hair, sensible boots, and the measured movements of someone who'd learned that hasty judgments usually created more problems than they solved. Marcus met him at the front gate, freshly showered and wearing his cleanest work clothes, trying to project the image of a responsible property owner rather than a desperate man, gambling everything on a plan he was making up as he went along. Behind him, the Daniels family had arranged themselves with the kind of strategic positioning that Amy had orchestrated based on what she called optimal visual presentation of educational family activity. Tommy stood near the practice fence, section, wearing safety glasses and holding measuring tools with practiced competence. Amy had positioned herself at a folding table covered with David Daniels's notebooks, pencils, and graph paper, looking like a dedicated student documenting her learning experience. Kevin was methodically organizing hand tools on a tarp, creating the kind of orderly workspace that suggested serious attention to proper procedure. The younger children played nearby under Claire's supervision, their presence serving as a reminder that this was fundamentally about family and home rather than commerce and profit. "Mr. Brewster," Marcus said, extending his hand, "thank you for coming out to clarify the situation." Brewster shook hands with the firm grip of someone accustomed to measuring character through physical contact. "Sheriff Thompson, understand. There's some question about the nature of activities taking place on this property. I can see how there might be confusion," Marcus replied carefully. "We're teaching the children practical skills for maintaining their own home. Seemed like the kind of education that would serve them well, regardless of what they decide to do with their lives." Brewster consulted his clipboard, scanning notes that had probably been dictated by someone in an office who'd never held a post-hole digger or struggled to make mortgage payments. Complaint alleges commercial construction activity, unlicensed contracting work, and unsafe employment of minors. Those are serious accusations if they're substantiated. "They would be serious," Marcus agreed, "but they don't describe what's actually happening here." Claire approached, carrying a steaming mug of coffee and wearing the kind of genuine smile that came from years of hospitality practiced under difficult circumstances. "Mr. Brewster, would you like some coffee? It's going to be warm today, but I always think conversations go better with refreshments." Brewster accepted the coffee gratefully, his professional demeanor softening slightly in response to Claire's natural warmth. "Thank you, Mrs. Daniels. I understand this is your family's property." "It was my late husband's family property," Claire corrected gently. "Sheriff Thompson purchased it at auction to keep my children from being homeless. We're all learning together how to maintain it properly." The inspector's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the kind of subtle change that suggested he was processing information that didn't match his preconceptions. "Learning together?" Tommy stepped forward with the confidence of someone who'd been coached but wasn't reciting a script. "My dad was a contractor, sir. He died before he could teach me everything he knew about taking care of property. Sheriff Marcus is helping us learn the skills Dad would have taught us if he'd had more time." Amy joined the conversation, holding her notebook like evidence of scholarly dedication. "I'm documenting everything we learned, sir. Measurements, techniques, safety procedures. My dad kept detailed records of all his projects, and I want to follow his example." Brewster examined Amy's notebook, scanning pages of careful handwriting, interspersed with diagrams and calculations. The documentation was thorough, thoughtful, and clearly focused on education rather than profit. "This is impressive work, young lady. You're planning to follow in your father's footsteps." "I'm planning to understand how things work," Amy replied. "Whether that leads to construction or engineering or just being a homeowner who can fix her own problems, the knowledge will be valuable." Kevin appeared at the inspector's elbow carrying a perfectly organized toolkit, each implement clean and properly arranged. "Want to see what we learned about tool maintenance, sir? Dad always said taking care of your equipment was the first responsibility of any craftsman." Marcus watched Brewster's body language relax as he engaged with the children, asking questions about their projects and examining their work with the kind of professional interest that came from genuine curiosity rather than regulatory obligation. It was becoming clear that Harold Brewster had expected to find a commercial operation disguised as family activity, but what he was discovering instead was exactly what they'd claimed: a family learning to take care of their home under the guidance of an adult who cared about their future. "Sheriff Thompson, Brewster said, turning his attention back to Marcus while continuing to flip through Amy's notebook. "What's your background in construction work?" "Minimal," Marcus admitted. "I'm learning alongside the children, using David Daniels' tools and notebooks as our primary educational resources. Everything we're doing is experimental and educational rather than professional." "And the fence project you're working on?" "Practice section behind the barn. We needed to repair damaged fencing anyway, and it seemed like a good opportunity for hands-on learning in a controlled environment." Brewster walked over to examine the fence work, running his hands along the posts they'd set and checking their alignment with a practiced eye. The work was solid, if not spectacular, showing the careful attention to detail that came from following written instructions rather than relying on experience. "Posts are properly spaced and adequately deep," he observed. "Wire tension looks correct. This is quality work for beginners." Tommy beamed with pride. "We spent a lot of time studying Dad's notes before we started. Wanted to make sure we honored his standards." "Your father would be proud," Brewster said simply, and Marcus could see Claire's eyes fill with tears at the unexpected kindness from a stranger who could have made their morning miserable, but was choosing instead to recognize effort and dedication. The inspection continued for another hour, with Brewster examining their workspace, reviewing safety procedures, and asking detailed questions about their learning objectives. Throughout the process, he maintained the thorough professionalism required by his position, while demonstrating the kind of human understanding that separated good officials from bureaucratic automatons. Finally, Brewster returned to his truck to complete his paperwork, spending several minutes writing notes and checking boxes on forms that would determine whether the Daniels family could continue their educational project or would be forced to abandon their plans under threat of legal action. "Sheriff Thompson," he said when he finished writing, "I'm going to file a report stating that I observed family members engaged in educational activities related to property maintenance and skill development. No evidence of commercial activity, no safety violations, no inappropriate involvement of minors in hazardous work." Marcus felt tension. He hadn't realized he was carrying drain from his shoulders. "Thank you, Mr. Brewster. We appreciate your thorough and fair evaluation." "Don't you thank me yet," Brewster replied, his expression becoming more serious. "My report will satisfy the immediate complaint, but it won't prevent future complaints from the same source. Mr. Garrison has the resources to continue making trouble if he chooses to do so." "Any suggestions for how to avoid future problems?" Brewster considered the question carefully. "Document everything. Keep detailed records of your activities, your educational objectives, and your safety procedures. If you decide to help neighbors with projects, make sure the arrangements are clearly personal favors rather than commercial transactions, and be careful about expanding too quickly or too visibly." Claire joined the conversation, her maternal instincts focused on protecting her children's newfound sense of purpose and belonging. "Mr. Brewster, will there be restrictions on what we can teach the children?" "Within reason, no. Parents have broad authority to provide practical education for their children, especially on their own property. Just maintain focus on education and family benefit rather than profit and business development." After Brewster left, the family gathered in the kitchen to process what had happened and plan their next steps. The immediate crisis had passed, but the underlying challenges remained. They still needed to generate $12,000 in 30 days. They still had a fence project to complete for Janet Morrison, and they still had to navigate the ongoing threat of interference from Frank Garrison. "Well," Marcus said, accepting another cup of Claire's coffee, "we survived our first bureaucratic challenge. How does everyone feel about continuing with our plans?" Tommy answered immediately, "I want to keep learning. This morning made me realize how much Dad knew that I still need to understand. Amy nodded agreement, and I want to finish documenting everything properly. If we're going to maintain this property for years to come, we need comprehensive records of what we learn. Kevin looked slightly confused but determined. I still don't completely understand why Mr. Garrison doesn't want us to fix fences, but I like working with tools and learning how things fit together. Claire surveyed her. Children with the kind of maternal satisfaction that came from watching them respond to challenges with courage rather than fear. I think we continue as planned, but we're more careful about how we present our activities to the community. Marcus agreed. Brewster's advice was sound. We document everything, we maintain focus on education and family benefit, and we're discreet about any help we provide to neighbors. The Janet Morrison project took on new significance in light of the morning's events. It would be their first test of working for compensation while maintaining the appearance of neighborly assistance rather than commercial activity. Everything they'd learned about technique would be magnified by the pressure of performing under scrutiny, and every decision they made would need to balance practical effectiveness with legal prudence. Marcus spent the afternoon reviewing David Daniels' most detailed project notes, trying to absorb 20 years of accumulated wisdom in preparation for a job that would require professional results from amateur workers. The notebooks revealed not just technical instructions, but philosophical approaches to craftsmanship, observations about the relationship between careful preparation and successful completion, insights about the importance of understanding why certain methods worked, rather than simply following procedures blindly. Claire found him in the barn office as evening approached, surrounded by open notebooks and looking slightly overwhelmed by the complexity of what they were attempting. "Second thoughts?" she asked gently. "More like 15th thoughts," Marcus replied. "Your husband was incredibly skilled, Claire. These notes represent decades of expertise that I'm trying to absorb in weeks." David didn't learn everything overnight either, she reminded him. He started as an apprentice, made mistakes, learned from people who knew more than he did. The difference was that he had years to develop his skills gradually. We don't have years, we have days. Claire sat down across from him, folding her hands on the desk surface that still showed the ring stains from coffee cups and the scratches from years of planning and calculating. "Marcus, when David got sick, I thought our world was ending. When he died, I was certain it had ended. But this week, watching my children learn skills their father would have been proud to teach them, seeing them work together towards something that matters, I realized that endings and beginnings sometimes look more similar than we expect." Marcus looked up from the notebooks, struck by the wisdom in her observation. "What do you mean?" "I mean that maybe we're not trying to replace David's expertise. Maybe we're trying to honor it by carrying forward the values he believed in. Quality work, family cooperation, community service, the satisfaction that comes from solving problems with your own hands. You think that's enough? Values without expertise? I think expertise without values is just technique, but values with determination can become expertise over time. David would rather see his children learning imperfectly but enthusiastically than not learning at all, because they were afraid of making mistakes. That evening, Marcus sat on the front porch, watching the sun set over property that was legally his but emotionally belonged to the family. He was learning to consider his own. The day had brought crisis and resolution, challenge and support, fear and hope in roughly equal measures. Tomorrow would bring the Janet Morrison project, their first real test of transforming good intentions into practical results. Tommy emerged from the house, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea and wearing the thoughtful expression that seemed to be his default setting when processing complex information. "Sheriff Marcus, can I ask you something?" "Of course." Tommy settled into the chair beside him, arranging his long legs with the awkward grace of someone still growing into his adult frame. "Why did you really buy our property? I mean, I know you said it was to help us, but there had to be easier ways to help if that's all you wanted to do." It was a perceptive question, the kind that required honesty rather than comfortable platitudes. Marcus considered his answer carefully, trying to identify motivations that had seemed clearer in the moment than they did in retrospect. "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. Part of it was seeing your family about to lose everything and knowing I had the power to prevent that. Part of it was being tired of watching good people struggle while others profited from their difficulties. And the other part," Marcus smiled at Tommy's persistence, "the other part was probably selfishness disguised as altruism. I've been living a pretty small life, Tommy. Apartment above the sheriff's station, limited responsibilities, no real connections to anything bigger than my next paycheck. Buying this property forced me to become part of something larger and more meaningful. You think that was selfish? I think it was human. People need to feel useful, need to know that their lives matter in ways that extend beyond their own immediate comfort. Your family gave me a chance to discover what I was capable of when the stakes actually mattered." Tommy nodded slowly, processing this information with the seriousness that seemed to characterize all his interactions with adult concepts. "Dad used to say that the best jobs were the ones where you couldn't tell the difference between work and helping people. Your dad was a wise man. Mom says you're becoming wise too, just through different experiences." Marcus felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. "Your mom is generous with her assessments. Not usually. She's pretty practical about most things. But she says you're teaching us that families can grow in unexpected directions, and that sometimes the best gifts are the ones that require work to appreciate properly." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over the farm, listening to the sounds of evening creatures beginning their nightly routines. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and closer to the house, the younger children's voices drifted through open windows as Claire supervised bedtime preparations. "Boo, Tommy," Marcus said eventually, "tomorrow we start the Morrison project. It's going to be different from our practice work. Harder, more pressure, higher stakes. You ready for that?" "I'm ready to find out if I'm ready," Tommy replied. "Dad always said that confidence comes from doing things you weren't sure you could do." Marcus smiled, recognizing David Daniels' philosophy in his son's words. "Then I guess we'll discover what we're capable of together." "Sheriff Marcus?" "Yeah? Thanks for giving us a chance to find out." As they prepared for bed that night, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in the space of a single week. 7 days ago, he'd been a bachelor sheriff, living paycheck to paycheck with no responsibilities beyond his official duties. Tonight, he was a property owner, surrogate father figure, business partner, and the primary adult responsible for 8 children's immediate future. The transformation should have been overwhelming, should have left him lying awake at night wondering what he'd gotten himself into and how he was going to manage obligations that exceeded his experience and resources. Instead, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow's challenges with the kind of anticipation that came from being part of something larger than himself. Tomorrow they would begin the Janet Morrison project, their first opportunity to transform everything they'd learned into income that could save their home. Tomorrow they would discover whether determination could substitute for experience, whether family teamwork could overcome individual limitations, and whether love really was strong. Enough to move fence posts and dig holes and stretch wire across distances that seemed impossible to bridge. But tonight they had proven that they could work together as a family, that they could learn new skills under pressure, and that they could defend their right to pursue their dreams against people who preferred to see them fail. Tonight, They had demonstrated that sometimes the most important victories were the ones that didn't make headlines, but changed lives one fence post at a time. Marcus fell asleep to the sound of an old house settling around a new family, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring fresh challenges, but also fresh opportunities to discover what they were capable of when they worked together toward something that mattered more than comfort or convenience, or the approval of people who measured success in dollars rather than determination. The story was entering a new chapter, one that would test everything they'd learned and reveal whether good intentions backed by hard work could truly transform impossible situations into something extraordinary. But tonight, it was enough to know that they were writing that story together, one day at a time, one lesson at a time, one fence post at a time. The Janet Morrison Fence Project began at sunrise on a Thursday morning that felt like stepping across a threshold from practice into reality. Marcus arrived at the Double M Ranch, carrying David Daniels' tools and accompanied by a crew that would have looked unusual to anyone who didn't understand the mathematics of desperation and hope. Tommy drove the old pickup truck with the careful attention of someone who understood that vehicle maintenance was now a family responsibility rather than a parental burden. Amy sat beside him with project notebooks and measuring equipment organized with military precision. Kevin bounced in the truck bed alongside fence posts and wire, his excitement barely contained by the safety lectures he'd received about riding in moving vehicles. Claire followed in her own car with the younger children, who would spend the day at a nearby playground while the work crew tackled their first paying job. The arrangement reflected the delicate balance they'd learned to maintain between family, involvement, and practical safety, between giving children meaningful roles and protecting them from hazards that required adult judgment and experience. Janet Morrison met them at the property line that needed attention, wearing work clothes and carrying coffee in a thermos that suggested she understood the value of caffeination for manual labor. She was a woman who'd spent 30 years managing ranch operations through drought, economic downturns, and the constant challenges that came with making a living from land that demanded respect rather than exploitation. "Morning, folks," she said, surveying the crew with the kind of assessment that came from years of evaluating whether people could deliver on their promises. "Ready to find out if all that practice translates into results?" Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle around his shoulders like a familiar burden. "We're ready to give it our best effort, Mrs. Morrison. If we run into problems we can't solve, we'll let you know immediately rather than trying to muddle through." Fair enough. Honesty's worth more than overconfidence in my experience. The existing fence line told a story of gradual deterioration and deferred maintenance. Wire sagging between posts that leaned at angles that defied geometry and common sense. Some sections had failed completely, leaving gaps where cattle could wander freely between properties, creating the kind of neighbor disputes that could fester for generations if not addressed promptly and professionally. Tommy surveyed the damage with the methodical approach he'd inherited from his father, walking the entire line before beginning work and taking notes about soil conditions, terrain challenges, and areas that would require special attention. Amy followed behind him, documenting measurements and creating diagrams that would guide their work and serve as references for future maintenance. "Biggest challenge is going to be the creek crossing," Tommy observed, pointing to an area where spring runoff had undermined fence posts and created erosion patterns that would complicate any repair efforts. Dad's notes mentioned several techniques for dealing with water drainage, but we've never actually tried any of them. Marcus examined the problematic area, trying to match David Daniels' written instructions with the reality of soggy soil and unstable ground. Theory was about to meet practice in ways that would test everything they thought they'd learned during their controlled experiments behind the barn. "What does your gut tell you?" Marcus asked Tommy. "That we start with the easy sections to build confidence and momentum, then tackle the creek crossing when we've got our rhythm established." It was sound strategy, the kind of practical wisdom that honored both human psychology and project management principles. They began work on the eastern section, where the ground was solid and the existing damage was straightforward, pulling old wire and removing posts that had rotted beyond salvage. Kevin proved surprisingly useful at clearing debris and organizing materials, his 12-year-old energy channeled into tasks that required enthusiasm more than expertise. Amy appointed herself quality control supervisor, checking measurements and alignment with the kind of attention to detail that would have impressed professional contractors. By mid-morning, they'd established a rhythm that felt both efficient and sustainable. Tommy and Marcus worked together on post-installation, combining Tommy's theoretical knowledge with Marcus's growing practical experience. Amy managed logistics and documentation, while Kevin handled material preparation and cleanup. It was a division of labor that maximized everyone's strengths while minimizing individual weaknesses. Janet Morrison appeared periodically to check progress, bringing cold drinks and offering encouragement that seemed genuine rather than obligatory. "You folks are moving faster than I expected," she observed during one visit, "and the work looks solid." "Tommy's got good instincts," Marcus replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Turns out watching a master craftsman for 16 years teaches you more than most people realize." His father would be proud. David was particular about his work, never cut corners even when customers wouldn't have known the difference. Tommy glowed at the praise, but Marcus could see that the compliment carried weight beyond simple encouragement. For a 16-year-old, still processing his father's death, having his skills recognized and connected to his father's legacy provided validation that reached deeper than monetary compensation. The creek crossing proved as challenging as anticipated, requiring techniques they'd read about but never attempted. Water had saturated the soil until it resembled thick pudding, making conventional post-hole digging nearly impossible. Daniel's notes recommended a combination of drainage improvement and specialized post-anchoring, but implementing those recommendations required problem-solving skills they were developing in real time. "What if we dig drainage channels to redirect the water flow?" Amy suggested, consulting her father's diagrams. According to his notes, controlling water movement is more important than fighting it. Tommy nodded thoughtfully. "Dad always said water wins eventually, so smart builders work with it instead of against it." They spent an hour digging shallow channels to redirect surface water away from the fence line, creating a drainage pattern that would protect their posts from future erosion while addressing the immediate installation challenges. It was slow, messy work that required patience and persistence rather than dramatic technical skills. Kevin discovered that his slight build made him particularly effective at maneuvering in tight spaces and handling tools in awkward positions. What had seemed like a disadvantage in terms of raw strength became an asset when precise positioning mattered more than brute force. By afternoon, they'd completed nearly half the fence line, working at a pace that balanced quality with efficiency. The posts were properly spaced and adequately deep. The wire tension was consistent, and the overall appearance reflected careful attention to both functionality and aesthetics. Marcus felt a growing sense of confidence that had nothing to do with overconfidence and everything to do with demonstrated competence. They were actually doing this. A family that had been facing homelessness a week ago was successfully completing professional quality work that would generate income towards saving their home. But the real transformation wasn't just about fence installation or income generation. It was about watching children discover they were capable of more than they'd imagined, about seeing a family work together towards shared goals, about the Satisfaction that came from solving problems through cooperation and determination. Tommy had evolved from a teenager trying to be the man of the house into a young man who actually was becoming the man of the house. Not through burden or obligation, but through competence and leadership earned honestly. Amy had discovered that her organizational skills and attention to detail were genuinely valuable assets rather than childhood quirks. Kevin had found ways to contribute meaningfully to adult projects, gaining confidence that would serve him well in future challenges. Most importantly, they were creating something together. Not just fence line, but family identity. Not just income, but purpose. Not just survival, but the foundation for something that could grow and develop over time. Janet Morrison appeared. As they were cleaning up for the day, surveying their progress with obvious satisfaction. "This is excellent work, folks. Better than I hoped for, honestly." "Thank you, Mrs. Morrison," Marcus replied. "We'll be back tomorrow to finish the remaining sections." "Actually, that's what I wanted to discuss. I've been talking to some neighbors, and word's getting around about the quality of your work. Nothing commercial," she added quickly, understanding their legal concerns. "Just neighbors mentioning to other neighbors that the Thompson family does reliable fence repair." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Additional work meant additional income, but it also meant increased visibility and the potential for renewed attention from Frank Garrison or other critics who might view their success as threatening rather than inspiring. "What kind of interest are we talking about?" Claire asked, having returned with the younger children as the workday concluded. "Well, the Hendersons need about 200 feet of fence repair along their north property line. Sarah Chen mentioned needing help with a deck that's got some loose boards, and Pastor Williams asked if y'all might consider helping with some maintenance projects around the church." Each opportunity represented money they desperately needed, but Marcus knew they had to be careful about how they approached additional work. Too much visibility could trigger renewed scrutiny from officials who might view their activities differently than Harold Brewster had. "Mrs. Morrison," Marcus said carefully, "we appreciate neighbors thinking of us for help with their projects. We'd need to make sure any assistance we provide remains clearly personal rather than commercial." "Understood completely. These would be neighbors helping neighbors, friends assisting friends, nothing formal or businesslike about it." That evening the family gathered around the kitchen table to count the day's earnings and plan their approach to the opportunities Janet Morrison had mentioned. $1,500 for the completed fence work, minus $800 for materials, left them with $700 profit for 2 days of labor. $700, Amy said, writing the number in her project notebook. "If we could average $350 a day, we'd have the tax money in about 5 weeks. "That's assuming we can find enough work to maintain that pace," Marcus cautioned, "and assuming we don't run into problems that slow us down or cost us money." Tommy looked up from the fence installation manual he'd been studying. "The Hendersons' project should take about 3 days. The Chen deck repair might be 2 days. Church maintenance could be ongoing. Which means steady work for the next month if we can manage our time properly," Claire observed, "plus whatever other opportunities come up through word of mouth." Marcus felt hope and anxiety in equal measure. The mathematics of their situation were becoming more manageable, but success would require them to maintain quality standards while increasing their work pace and expanding their skill set. Every project would be a test, every satisfied customer a step toward financial stability. But more than that, success would mean proving that families could overcome impossible circumstances through cooperation and determination. It would mean demonstrating that children could be partners in their own rescue rather than passive recipients of adult assistance. It would mean showing that sometimes the most important transformations happen not through dramatic gestures, but through steady work toward shared goals, 3 weeks later, Marcus stood in the same courthouse square where the auction had taken place, holding a cashier's check for $12,467 and wearing the kind of smile that comes from accomplishing something you weren't entirely sure was possible. Behind him, the entire Daniels family waited in a group that looked more confident and unified than the frightened cluster of children who'd watched their home get sold to the highest bidder. Gerald Finch accepted the tax payment with the professional courtesy of someone who'd processed thousands of similar transactions, but Marcus could see surprise in his expression as he examined the documentation. "This is the full amount owed, including penalties and interest." "Quite impressive, Sheriff Thompson." "Teamwork," Marcus replied simply. "Amazing what people can accomplish when they work together towards something that matters." The formal transaction took only minutes, but the significance extended far beyond bureaucratic requirements. They'd done it. Through fence repairs and deck maintenance, church projects and neighbor assistance, family cooperation and community support, they'd generated the money needed to secure their home. But the real transformation wasn't measured in dollars or tax payments. It was visible in Tommy's growing confidence as he taught younger siblings the skills their father would have passed along. It was evident in Amy's detailed project records that documented not just work completed, but lessons learned and capabilities developed. It was apparent in Kevin's pride at being a contributing member of the family work crew, rather than just another mouth to feed. Most importantly, it was reflected in Claire's expression as she watched her children discover they were capable of far more than survival. They were capable of growth, contribution, leadership, and the kind of problem-solving that transformed obstacles into opportunities. The courthouse steps where Frank Garrison had tried to buy their property for development had become the place where they'd proven that some things couldn't be purchased with money alone. They demonstrated that families were stronger than finances, that determination was more powerful than debt, and that love could indeed move mountains when it was channeled through concrete actions rather than abstract intentions. Eleanor Martinez appeared as they prepared to leave, walking slowly but purposefully across the square with her carved wooden cane and the kind of satisfied expression that came from investments that had paid dividends exactly as anticipated. "Sheriff Thompson," she said, "I trust the tax situation has been resolved satisfactorily." "Yes, ma'am. And Mrs. Martinez, I want you to know that we'll begin making payments on our debt to you as soon as we can organize our finances properly." Eleanor smiled, the kind of gentle expression that held decades of wisdom about the difference between owing money and owing gratitude. "Sheriff, I didn't co-sign that loan as an investment in property. I invested in people, in family, in the kind of community I want to live in. The only payment I require is watching you continue to be the kind of people who deserve that investment." "Mrs. Martinez." "Sheriff Thompson," she interrupted kindly but firmly, "some things are more valuable than money. What you've accomplished here, what you've taught these children about working together and taking responsibility for their own futures, that's worth more than any financial return I could calculate." As they walked back toward their vehicles, Marcus reflected on how completely his life had changed in the space of a month. He'd gone from bachelor sheriff living paycheck to surrogate father of 8 children, property owner, small business operator, and the primary adult, responsible for a family's daily welfare and long-term future. The transformation should have been overwhelming, should have left him questioning every decision and wondering if he'd bitten off more than he could reasonably chew. Instead, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow's challenges with the kind of anticipation that came from knowing he was part of something larger and more meaningful than individual success or personal comfort. Tommy appeared at his side, no longer the uncertain teenager who'd been trying to hold his family together through sheer determination. "Sheriff Marcus, what's next?" Marcus smiled, understanding that the question encompassed more than immediate project planning. Next, we keep building, Tommy. We keep learning, keep working together, keep proving that families can overcome anything when they support each other properly. Sounds like a plan. Sounds like a life. That evening, as sunset painted the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson, Marcus sat on the front porch of a house that was legally his, but emotionally belonged to all of them. Around him, the sounds of family life continued with the comfortable rhythm of people who'd learned to work together toward shared goals. Children's voices mixed with the distant sounds of livestock and the gentle creaking of fence lines that would stand strong for years to come. He'd come to the auction that Tuesday morning thinking he might help a family in crisis. What he'd discovered instead was that helping others was the most reliable way to help yourself, that families could grow in unexpected directions, and that sometimes the most important investments were the ones that paid dividends in ways you couldn't measure with money. The Daniels property was safe, the family was unified, and tomorrow would bring new opportunities to discover what they were capable of when they worked together. It wasn't the life Marcus had planned, but it was the life he'd chosen. And that made all the difference. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories were the ones that began with ordinary people making extraordinary choices, one fence post at a time, one family member at a time, one day at a time. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very determined, those stories had endings that looked exactly like new beginnings. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.